Welcome back, everyone, to Beyond the Known.
Glad to be back.
So glad to have you here for part 2 of our UFOs series.
Right.
If you joined us for the last deep dive, we really got into the weeds, all the strange and unsettling details of the Travis Walton abduction case.
Absolutely.
And this time we're shifting our focus to maybe the biggest story in all of UFO lore.
Definitely a contender.
The Roswell Incident.
Oh, yeah. Roswell. I mean, just that name.
It sparks something, doesn't it?
It sparks so many questions, and I think that's why it's just captured the imagination for so long. You know, crashed spacecraft, government cover-ups, shadowy figures. It's got all the elements of a really compelling mystery. And to understand why it still resonates so strongly today, we really need to kind of rewind the clock back to 1947.
Back to the beginning.
Summer of 47. And what was happening then, across the U.S., there was this, I don't know if you call it a wave, but a surge in these reports of what were being called at the time flying saucers.
Yeah. It was a real phenomenon. I mean, people were seeing things in the skies that they just couldn't explain with what they knew.
Right. And I think it's important to highlight this because people often jump immediately to aliens.
Right.
Right.
But that wasn't the first thing that everyone thought of.
No. It was a time of uncertainty, right? It was post-war. We're on the verge of the Cold War, and people were trying to make sense of these sightings using the frameworks they had.
Right.
So was it some weird weather thing? Was it some kind of mass hysteria or delusion, some psychological phenomenon? There was even talk about, maybe the Soviets had some secret technology, or we were seeing remnants of Nazi technology from World War II. The idea of extraterrestrial visitors was out there, but it wasn't the dominant explanation. Not yet, anyway.
It's interesting, right? Because the backdrop to all of this is the beginning of the Cold War. And we have all these heightened tensions and paranoia about potential enemies, all the secrecy and mistrust swirling around.
Yeah, absolutely.
And right in the middle of this, we have Roswell, New Mexico. Right.
And Roswell, at first glance, it might seem like any other small town with a military base, but it was actually really strategically important. So let's talk a bit about why.
Yeah, I think that's crucial to understanding this story because you can't separate it from the context.
Yeah.
So Roswell, what was it? First off, it was home to the 509th Bomb Group. And these weren't just any airmen.
These were the guys.
Who
dropped the bombs.
Who carried out the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Yeah.
So you're talking about a highly skilled, highly trained, incredibly important unit. And then, of course, you have the Roswell Army Airfield itself, a vital installation at the time.
And its location.
Yeah.
I mean, Roswell wasn't in the middle of nowhere. It was actually pretty close to some very sensitive top-secret sites.
Yeah.
It was right in the thick of it. You had White Sands Missile Range not too far away, Alamogordo, places where really groundbreaking research was being done, the early days of missile technology, rocketry, all sorts of cutting-edge stuff. So Roswell was, at the center of this region that was just buzzing with military secrets and advanced technology.
So we've got this nationwide thing happening, right? People are seeing these unidentified objects in the sky. And we've got this strategically vital military town in the heart of a region where all this classified work is going on.
Right.
And then summer of 47.
Yeah.
Something unusual happens.
Something happens. Something crashes.
And the story begins. So what exactly happened in those early days of July 1947?
Well, this is where it starts to get interesting, right? Because we have different narratives. But what we know for sure is that a local rancher, his name was Matt Brazel, found some pretty strange wreckage on his property.
This was on his ranch.
His ranch, the Foster Ranch, about 75 miles northwest of Roswell. And what's key here is that Brazel, he was a rancher. He knew the land.
He knew what belonged there and what didn't.
And what didn't. And he couldn't figure out what this material was. It was just completely foreign to him.
Yeah.
So he does what any reasonable person would do. He takes it to the authorities. He takes it to the sheriff in Shays County.
Right. So he goes to the sheriff, and the sheriff's like, I don't know what this is either.
I have no idea.
I've never seen anything like this.
Right. It was that level of, we can't identify this. So that's when they decide to get the military involved.
They call in the big guns.
Right. Specifically, they call the Roswell Army Airfield and Colonel Blanchard, who was the base commander at the time.
So we have a rancher finds this bizarre debris. The local law enforcement can't figure it out. And now the military is getting pulled in.
Right.
This is where things really start to take off. So what happens next?
Well, Colonel Blanchard, he takes this seriously.
Yeah.
He sends his base intelligence officer, a Major Jesse Marcel Sr., along with a CIC agent from the Counterintelligence Corps to go investigate Brazil's findings.
So they head out to the ranch.
Head out to the ranch. And this is where the narratives start to really diverge.
Yeah. We've got all these theories, all these explanations, but let's start with the official story, the one that the military put out at first.
All right, so the initial official explanation, the one that really captured the public's attention, was the announcement of the recovery of a flying disc.
That's the big one.
That's the big one. So we know Matt Brazil finds the debris. Major Marcel Sr. goes out to the site. And the debris field, by all accounts, was pretty spread out. It was scattered over a wide area.
So this wasn't like one small contained crash site.
Not at all.
This was like something had broken up.
Right.
And pieces were strewn over a large area.
Exactly. And then the account of Jesse Marcel Jr., Major Marcel's son, he becomes really important here because he later described his father bringing some of this debris home. And what he said about the nature of the debris is fascinating.
Yeah, tell me more about this.
So, according to Jesse Marcel Jr., this material that his father showed him was unlike anything he'd ever seen. He talked about metallic fragments. These things were super lightweight, but also incredibly strong.
A strange combination.
Right. And one of the most talked about characteristics is that this material would actually, when you crumpled it up or deformed it, it would seemingly return to its original shape.
What? Like memory metal or something?
Yeah. He even described it as, like, if you spread water on a table, it just goes flat, no wrinkles.
That's why. I mean, that's not how metal typically behaves.
Not at all. That's what makes it so strange.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just that. Marcel Jr. also described I-beam-like pieces. But what made these really interesting were the markings on them, like these strange geometric symbols that ran along the inner surface. At first glance, he thought they might be hieroglyphics, like Egyptian hieroglyphics. But then he took a closer look and realized they were different. He said there were shapes like oblate spheroids.
Oblate spheroids.
Yeah, the geometric shape like a flattened sphere.
But there were also triangles and even shapes that reminded him of, like the profile of Mount Everest.
And he specifically mentioned that these markings had this kind of violet-purple hue to them and a semi-reflective quality.
So we've got a credible military intelligence officer
Right.
investigating this debris that no one can figure out what it is. His own son describes these very peculiar properties and markings.
Right.
So it's no wonder that the initial thought was that maybe this was something truly extraordinary.
Absolutely. And that's what led to the Roswell Army Airfield issuing that press release.
The one that said they'd recovered a flying disc.
Right. And this news obviously spread like wildfire. It made headlines all over the country.
Flying disc found in Roswell, New Mexico. That's got to be front page news.
Front page news, absolutely.
But this excitement was really short-lived, wasn't it?
It was. It was incredibly short-lived because the official story changed almost immediately.
So what happened?
Within a day or two of that initial announcement, the military issued a retraction. The narrative flipped completely.
Okay. So what did they say it was then?
Okay. So the retraction came from Brigadier General Ramey, who was stationed in Fort Worth, Texas. He held a press conference and presented some debris, but he said it was just parts of a weather balloon and a radar target.
A weather balloon?
Yeah. Specifically, he identified this radar target as a Rowan target, ML307B. These things were basically like box kites made of sticks and metallic paper, and they were used to track weather conditions in the upper atmosphere.
So from a flying disc to a weather balloon, quite a shift in the narrative.
A pretty dramatic shift, right?
And of course, this is a major point of contention for people who believe something more extraordinary happened at Roswell.
Absolutely. And Jesse Marcel Jr., he never backed down from his claim that the debris his father brought home was not a weather balloon. He was adamant that what he saw in Roswell was not what General Ramey was showing the press in Fort Worth.
And that discrepancy, right, the initial report, the quick retraction, Marcel Jr. sticking to his story, it's a big reason why Roswell is still such a mystery.
Totally. It just raises so many questions. If it wasn't a weather balloon, then what was it? And that's where all these different theories come into play.
Exactly. So let's dig into some of those theories.
Let's do it.
The first one we should talk about is Project Mogul. Decades later, the Air Force tried to give a more complete explanation of what happened in Roswell. They released a couple of reports, one in 1995 called the Roswell Report, Fact versus Fiction, and another in 1997 called the Roswell Report, Case Closed. And in those reports, they put forward Project Mogul as the real source of the debris.
Right. And this has become one of the most common explanations for Roswell. So what was Project Mogul?
Well, it was a top-secret program, of course.
Top secret, of course. It involved these high-altitude balloons. And the goal was to try and detect sound waves from Soviet nuclear tests.
So kind of like spy balloons.
In a way, yeah. The idea was that these balloons would carry sensitive microphones up into the tropopause, which is this layer in the atmosphere. And they hoped these microphones could pick up the sound waves from these explosions, even from far away.
So these weren't just your average weather balloons.
No. These were much more sophisticated. They were huge. I mean, an array of these balloons could be 600 to 800 feet long.
Wow.
Yeah. They were made of multiple neoprene balloons. They had radar reflectors, measuring instruments, and all this reinforcing tape to hold it together.
And because it was a classified project, the Air Force argued that this could explain the initial secrecy and maybe why people misidentified the debris.
Right. They said, look, because it was top secret, we couldn't just come out and tell everyone what it was. So people saw this weird stuff and they jumped to conclusions.
And Project Mogul also addressed some of the more specific details of the Roswell incident, like those unusual markings that Jesse Marcel Jr. described.
Right. There was a professor, Charles B. Moore, who worked on the balloon launches for Project Mogul. He was at NYU. They were a key part of the program. And he actually presented a radar reflector, similar to the ones they used in Mogul. And he said that the tape, the reinforcing tape they used on the balloons, had these funny markings on it. And some UFO researchers thought these markings were the same as what Marcel Jr. described as hieroglyphics. But Professor Moore said, no. This tape came from a toy factory in New York City, and the markings were just designs for kids' toys, like little flowers and stuff.
So not alien writing, just something from a toy factory.
Right.
Okay. But even with Project Mogul as an explanation, there's still some things that don't quite add up.
There are. For one thing, there's this diary entry from another guy who worked on the project, Albert T. Kreb. And he wrote that flight number 4, which is the specific Mogul flight that's supposed to have crashed at Roswell.
Okay.
He said it was canceled. It never actually launched.
That's a pretty big problem for the Project Mogul theory.
Yeah, if the flight didn't happen, then how could it have crashed and left that debris?
Yeah.
And there are other inconsistencies, too. Charles Moore himself, the professor who presented the radar reflector.
Yeah.
He remembered flight number 4 launching and performing well. So his memory clashes with what's in the diary.
So conflicting accounts from the people who are actually there.
Exactly. And there's another issue. Back then, there were safety regulations that usually prevented them from launching these big balloons in cloudy weather.
Okay.
Or before dawn. But more specifically remembered flight 4 launching at something like 2:3 in the morning.
So the official records, the memories of the people involved, they don't all perfectly line up with this Project Mogul explanation.
Right. And that's what keeps the debate going.
So what about the other side of this?
Yeah.
People who believe something truly extraterrestrial happened at Roswell.
Right. And that's where we get into the real heart of the Roswell legend.
The alien crash theory.
The alien crash theory. The idea that it wasn't a weather balloon, it wasn't some experimental project, but an actual spacecraft from another world that came down in the New Mexico desert.
And that the military not only recovered the wreckage,
but also the bodies of the alien crew.
This is the image that pops into most people's heads when they hear Roswell.
It is. And over the years, this theory has become really elaborate with all these supposed pieces of evidence and witness accounts.
Right. So let's break down the core elements of this alien crash theory. What are the main claims?
All right. The most basic claim is that an alien spacecraft crashed near Roswell.
Okay.
And along with the wreckage, the U.S. military recovered the bodies of the aliens who were on board.
And these accounts often describe a massive, super secret military operation to cover it all up.
Oh, yeah. That's a big part of the story. People talk about these roadblocks popping up, entire roads being shut down, a huge retrieval operation to secure the crash site, and anything that came from it.
Like a scene out of a sci-fi movie.
Exactly. And proponents of this theory say, look, if it was just a weather balloon, why all the secrecy? Why the massive cover-up?
Right. Why go to such extreme lengths to hide something so mundane?
Right. So that's the basic framework of the alien crash theory. But then there are all these additional elements that have been woven into it over the years. One of the big ones is the MJ-12 documents.
Okay, MJ-12. This is a big one in the UFO world. Can you explain what those documents are and what they're supposed to reveal?
So the MJ-12 documents are a collection of these alleged classified government memos.
Okay.
And they first surfaced in the 1980s. Some of the key ones are called the Truman-Forrestal memo, the Eisenhower briefing document, and the Cutler-Twining memo.
So, named after the presidents and other high-ranking officials who were supposedly involved?
Right. And the central claim of these documents is that there was this super-secret government committee
codenamed Majestic 12, or MJ-12 for short, and they were supposedly formed by President Truman to investigate the Roswell crash and figure out what to do about the whole extraterrestrial situation.
And the documents actually name specific people who were allegedly part of this group.
Yeah. Big names. Military leaders, scientists, intelligence officials, people at the highest levels of government.
A real who's who of powerful figures.
Exactly. And these documents say that MJ-12 was tasked with studying the recovered alien tech, figuring out how to keep the public from panicking, and basically developing a plan for dealing with aliens in the long run.
It's pretty heady stuff. But of course, the authenticity of these documents is hotly debated.
Oh, yeah. There are people who believe they're real and people who think they're complete fakes.
So what are the arguments for and against their authenticity?
All right. So the people who think the MJ-12 documents are real, they point to things like specific dates and locations mentioned in the documents that seem to match up with things we know happened historically. For example, Stanton Friedman, he's a big name in UFO research.
Yeah.
He spent a lot of time looking into these documents. And he found what he thought were connections between things mentioned in the Truman-Forstall memo and President Truman's actual schedule. Like there was a meeting that supposedly took place between James Forstall, who was Secretary of Defense at the time, and Vannevar Bush, who was a prominent scientist. And Friedman says that meeting lines up with the date on the memo.
So trying to find real-world events that match up with what's in the documents.
Right. And then there's the Eisenhower briefing document. It's dated November 18th, 1952. And Friedman says that matches up with a known briefing that President-elect Eisenhower received.
So, again, looking for corroborating evidence.
Right. And General Nathan Twining, who's another supposed MJ-12 member.
Okay.
There are flight logs that suggest he was in New Mexico around the time of the Roswell incident.
Interesting.
And Friedman argues that Twining even canceled a previous engagement to be there.
So trying to build a case that these documents are legitimate based on what we know from history.
Exactly.
But there's another side to this.
Oh, yeah. The skeptics.
What are their arguments against the authenticity of these MJ-12 documents?
Okay. So skeptics, guys like Joe Nickel, they've done their own deep dives into these documents.
Okay.
And they found all sorts of red flags. For one, there are factual errors.
So things in the documents that are just plain wrong.
Right, like dates that don't make sense, or information that contradicts what we know from other sources.
Okay.
There are also inconsistencies in the way the dates are formatted.
Like not the standard military or government way of doing things.
Exactly.
Okay.
And probably the biggest issue, the original versions of these key memos.
Like the Eisenhower briefing document, the Truman-Forstall memo?
Those have never actually been found.
Oh, interesting. So all we have are copies.
Copies, photocopies.
Right. So it's hard to verify if they're the real deal.
Right. And then there's the Cutler-Twining memo. Robert Cutler's the guy who supposedly wrote it.
Okay.
But records show he was in Europe at the time it was supposedly written.
So he couldn't have written it.
Right. And then there are all these questions about how the documents were discovered.
Okay, how so?
Often, it was UFO researchers themselves who found them.
Oh, okay.
In some archive or another.
So there's a potential for, people planting evidence or fabricating things to support their beliefs.
Right. That's the argument the skeptics make.
So the MJ-12 documents remain this very controversial and unproven piece of the Roswell story. There's no clear consensus on whether they're real or fake.
Exactly.
Okay. So what about eyewitness accounts from people who say they saw the alien beings or the crash site?
Well, over the years, lots of people have come forward with stories like that. One of them is Frank Kaufman. He was a master sergeant stationed at Roswell at the time.
Okay.
And he claimed he was part of this counterintelligence unit that was involved in the recovery operation.
Wow.
And he said he saw this strange craft and these alien beings. 2 of them were dead, but one was supposedly still alive.
And did he describe what they look like?
He did. He gave a pretty detailed description, but there's no real independent evidence to back up his story.
So it's his word against, well, no one really knows.
Right.
Okay. And then there's that famous alien autopsy film.
Right. The one that supposedly shows a dissection of an alien body from Roswell.
Yeah.
But that footage has been pretty much debunked.
Really?
Yeah. Experts who looked at it say it's most likely a hoax.
Like a staged thing.
Yeah. And even the cameraman who was involved, he's given all these conflicting statements about whether it's real or not. He even called the beings in the film freaks at one point.
So not exactly a ringing endorsement of its authenticity?
Not really.
Okay. So besides the people who claim to have seen the evidence firsthand, there are others who suggest there was a deliberate cover-up by the authorities. Like, they knew what really happened, but they decided to keep it quiet.
Right. There's a guy named Frank Joyce. He was a radio announcer in Roswell back then.
Okay.
And he said he was threatened after he reported Matt Brazel's initial story.
Wow. Like, told to keep quiet about it.
Yeah, basically.
Okay.
And then there's Colonel Thomas Dubose. He was chief of staff under General Ramey.
Okay.
He later said that the whole weather balloon explanation was just a cover story.
So he admitted that they were lying.
He said it was a cover story to hide what really happened.
But if it wasn't a weather balloon, what were they hiding? That's the big question.
It is, and it brings us back to all those different theories.
Okay. So we've talked about the weather balloon explanation, Project Mogul, the alien crash theory, and the claims of a government cover-up. It's a lot to take in.
It is. It's a lot of different pieces of the puzzle.
And the official explanations themselves have changed over time. After the weather balloon story and Project Mogul, the Air Force offered another possible reason for those accounts of alien bodies.
Right. In that 1997 report, the Roswell report, case closed.
The one that was supposed to settle it all.
Yeah. They said that maybe those stories about alien bodies came from crash test dummies.
Crash test dummies.
Yeah. They said the military was using them in high-altitude experiments in the 1950s. And they suggested that maybe over time, witnesses got the dates mixed up. Like they saw these dummies being recovered, and their memories morphed it into part of the Roswell incident.
So like a conflation of different events.
Right.
It's an interesting idea.
It is.
But even if that explains some of the later accounts, it doesn't address those initial reports from 1947.
True. And it also relies on the idea that people's memories are unreliable.
Which is a whole other debate.
Right.
And we have to factor in the whole cultural context surrounding Roswell.
Absolutely. We can't ignore the power of myth and storytelling.
And the fact that this happened at the dawn of the flying saucer era.
Right. It was a time when people were becoming fascinated with the idea of space travel and the possibility of life on other planets.
It was the beginning of the modern UFO phenomenon.
Exactly. And Roswell, because it was one of the first and most publicized incidents, it kind of became a blank slate for people to project their beliefs and fears onto.
A focal point for all this cultural anxiety and fascination with the unknown. So it's no wonder the story has grown and evolved over the decades.
Yeah. It's been shaped and reshaped by all these different forces. Personal beliefs, cultural trends, the media, and even the government's own shifting explanations.
It's truly fascinating how this one event in the summer of 1947 has sparked so many different interpretations. From simple explanations like weather balloons to these grand theories about crashed alien spacecraft and government cover-ups.
Right. And that's what makes the Roswell incident so enduring. It's this intersection of real events, personal testimonies, official secrecy, and our own human desire to understand the universe around us.
It really highlights the complex and often contradictory nature of truth, especially when it comes to events shrouded in mystery and fueled by speculation.
Absolutely.
We've explored all these different explanations, misidentified weather balloons, the secret Project Mogul, the possibility of a crashed alien craft, the claims of a cover-up.
And yet, the central questions remain unanswered.
If it wasn't a weather balloon, what was it? What really happened at Roswell?
And maybe that's part of the enduring appeal of this story, the fact that it's still an unsolved mystery.
A puzzle with missing pieces.
And it makes us think about our place in the cosmos, the possibility of life beyond Earth, and whether there are things happening in the shadows that we're not supposed to know about.
So, while the official explanations have changed over the years, a lot of people are still not convinced.
It's hard to let go of a good mystery.
And the lack of definitive proof, physical evidence that would settle it once and for all, just adds to the intrigue.
It does. It keeps the debate alive.
So what do you think? What parts of the Roswell story resonate most with you?
What makes the most sense? What leaves you with more questions than answers?
What do you find most credible?
We'd love to hear your thoughts on this enduring mystery.
And here's a final thought to ponder as we wrap up this deep dive.
All right.
Could the truth about Roswell be a combination of some of these theories?
Interesting.
Like maybe it was something unusual, something we don't fully understand, but ultimately something from Earth. But then, over time, that initial event got embellished, mixed up with other events, and became the Roswell legend we know today.
I mean, that's certainly possible. The way stories change and grow over time, it's fascinating.
Or maybe there's something else at play entirely.
Something we haven't even considered.
What is it about this one event more than almost any other that has captured our collective imagination for over 75 years?
That's the real question.
Thanks for joining us on Beyond the Known.
It's been a pleasure.
If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Roswell incident, please hit that like button, follow our show.
And subscribe for more explorations into the mysteries that lie beyond our conventional understanding.
Until next time.
Keep looking up.